On a winter evening in 1897, the marble façade at 841 Fifth Avenue on the corner of East 65th Street glowed softly above the carriage lamps. Inside the mansion that Richard Morris Hunt had completed only the year before, New York's most guarded space was already awake. At the rear of the house, the great ballroom, part gallery, part theater, rose in gilded tiers around a sea of paintings and a single improbable object. A vast red velvet circular ottoman built around a marble urn, placed exactly at the room's center. Satin-paneled walls were crowded with canvases, crystal chandeliers and carved cornices dissolved into a haze of light and gold. The press would later call this room the inner sanctum of New York society, a chamber that could admit 1,200 guests, yet truly belonged to a few dozen names. Tonight the ottoman waits, empty beneath the chandeliers. It is both a seat and a test. Whoever is invited to sit upon it is confirmed. Whoever circles it and is never summoned will not be remembered. In another generation, the room itself will be gone, and only the photographs will recall who once believed this stage could not be dismantled. In the spring of 1862, when Caroline Webster Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., the grandson of America's first multimillionaire, the young couple commissioned a residence that would anchor their claim to social authority in a city still uncertain about its own hierarchy. The house they built stood at 355th Avenue at the corner of 34th Street on a parcel that would one day bear the Empire State Building. It was not, at first glance, a revolutionary structure. 4 stories of Nova Scotia freestone rose in the brownstone mode, then favored by families who had made their fortunes in shipping, fur, and Manhattan real estate. Corinthian columns framed the entrance. A low iron fence separated a modest front garden from the sidewalk. Next door, at number 338, William's brother John Jacob Astor III built an identical house, and the two families shared a rear garden shaded by ailanthus trees and hemmed by carriage houses. The street itself was still forming its identity. In the 1860s, Fifth Avenue above 23rd Street remained a patchwork of vacant lots, modest row houses, and the occasional mansion. The Astors were among the first to move decisively uptown, bringing with them the weight of a name that had, for 2 generations, meant wealth so vast it required no explanation. John Jacob Astor, the fur trader who had died in 1848, had left an estate valued at $20 million, more than any other American. His son, William Backhouse Astor Sr., had doubled it through real estate. Now the third generation was translating money into social architecture. Caroline, 22 years old in 1862, understood that a house was not merely shelter but a stage. Born into the Schermerhorn family, whose Dutch and Huguenot roots reached back to New Amsterdam, she possessed what newer fortunes could not buy: lineage. The Astors had money, the Schermerhorns had memory. The marriage fused capital with pedigree, and the house at 355th Avenue was the first physical expression of that union. Its exterior discretion, the plain brownstone, the restrained ornament, signaled old money restraint. But inside, the rooms accumulated in ways that hinted at a different ambition. Visitors entered through a vestibule lined with dark wood, then passed into a series of drawing rooms that grew progressively more ornate as one moved toward the rear of the house. The first drawing room, nearest the street, was decorated in sober tones: mahogany furniture, heavy drapes, gaslight fixtures that gave a warm, subdued glow. The second drawing room introduced brighter colors: crimson upholstery, gilt-framed mirrors, and the third, at the back of the ground floor, opened into what would become the heart of Caroline's social domain, an art gallery that doubled on certain evenings as a ballroom. By the 1870s, this rear gallery had been expanded. The old stables behind the house were demolished, and in their place rose a purpose-built exhibition space with skylights, parquet floors, and walls designed to hold dozens of paintings. Contemporary accounts describe entering the gallery as stepping into a private museum. European landscapes, portraits of aristocrats, genre scenes by Dutch masters. The collection was modest by the standards of the great European collections, but in New York in the 1870s, it was enough to establish Caroline Astor as a patron of culture, not merely a wife of wealth. The gallery was also where Caroline began to entertain. At first, The gatherings were small, 50 or 60 guests for a musical, perhaps 100 for a winter reception. But as the decade progressed, the numbers grew. By the early 1880s, Caroline's annual ball at 355th Avenue had become the most important event on the social calendar, the one evening when New York's wealthiest families gathered under a single roof to confirm, through their presence, that they belonged to an exclusive circle. The press began to notice. Society columns in the New York Times and the Herald listed arrivals, described gowns, and speculated about who had been invited and who had not. Inside the gallery, gaslight gave way to early electric fixtures, and the paintings on the walls served a dual purpose. They demonstrated taste, and they absorbed sound, softening the echo of footsteps and conversation into a murmur that felt both intimate and grand. Caroline herself occupied a specific position in the room. Visitors who left memoirs or letters describe her standing near the center of the gallery, beneath a crystal chandelier dressed in black velvet or dark silk, her diamond stomacher catching the light. Around her, the room arranged itself in concentric circles, the inner ring of women who had known her since girlhood, a second ring of younger women seeking her approval, a third ring of men, husbands, sons, brothers, who understood that access to Caroline's ballroom was not automatic, but earned. By the mid-1880s, a new piece of furniture had appeared in the gallery, a circular ottoman upholstered in red velvet, built around a tall marble urn. It was placed near the center of the room, not quite at the geometric midpoint, but close enough to suggest intention. Photographs from the period show it surrounded by potted palms and smaller chairs, a kind of satellite system orbiting a social sun. The ottoman was large enough to seat a dozen women, and on crowded evenings it became a destination. Those invited to sit there were understood to have passed some invisible threshold of acceptance. Those who circled the room without ever being summoned to the ottoman learned quietly that their place in Caroline's world had limits. The house at 355th Avenue was never meant to be a palace. It was a brownstone among brownstones, distinguished only by the names on the mailbox and the quality of the gatherings inside. But by 1890, it had become something more, a filter through which New York society passed, a mechanism for sorting those who belonged from those who merely aspired. The brownstone's plainness was, in retrospect, part of its power. From the street, it looked like a dozen other houses on Fifth Avenue. Inside, it held a world that only a few hundred people ever saw. In photographs, the gallery appears crowded and warm, lit by chandeliers and filled with faces turned toward the camera. The paintings blur into a golden haze. The ottoman sits, always, at the center. But the photographs also reveal what words could not. The house was aging. The brownstone façade, once fashionable, was already beginning to look dated by the 1890s. Newer mansions built in limestone and marble were rising further uptown in styles imported from France and Italy. The old brownstone restraint was giving way to a new architectural language, one that said power not through discretion but through display. Caroline's house, for all its interior magnificence, was beginning to be overtaken by the very city it had once seemed to define. In the brownstone at 355th Avenue, the doorway to the ballroom was invisible from the street, but everyone in New York knew exactly where it was. By the late 1880s, Caroline Astor and her advisor, Ward McAllister, had refined a social technology so precise that it could be expressed as a single number, 400. The figure appeared in newspapers, circulated in conversation, and eventually hardened into myth. It was said to represent the number of people who truly counted in New York society, the families who possessed not just wealth, but the intangible quality of ease in the grandest ballrooms, a kind of inherited grace that could not be learned or bought. The number was both specific and symbolic, and its origin story would be told and retold until it became difficult to separate fact from legend. Ward McAllister, a Georgia-born lawyer who had given up his practice to become what he called a social architect, was Caroline's collaborator in this project of definition. He had spent years in Europe studying the rituals of aristocratic courts, and he returned to New York convinced that American society needed its own codified hierarchy. McAllister understood that social power required not just money, but presentation, the correct invitation, the proper introduction, the right table arrangement. He advised Caroline on guest lists, planned the order of dances, and, crucially, articulated the criteria by which families might be judged worthy of inclusion. In interviews and published essays, McAllister insisted that only families with at least 3 generations of wealth and the ability to move at ease in the grandest ballrooms truly belonged to the inner circle. The phrasing was revealing. It was not enough to own a mansion or possess a fortune. One had to carry oneself with a certain unconscious confidence, the product of having been raised in spaces where marble floors and crystal chandeliers were ordinary. This was, McAllister argued, what separated the true elite from the merely rich. Newcomers, no matter how wealthy, betrayed themselves through small anxieties, a glance toward the wrong door, an uncertain pause before a dance, that marked them as outsiders. The legend that the number 400 corresponded exactly to the capacity of Caroline's ballroom at 355th Avenue became gospel. Newspapers repeated it, and later historians accepted it as fact. But the reality was more complex. Architectural records and floor plans suggest that the art gallery ballroom could hold between 200 and 300 guests comfortably, perhaps 400 if crowded. The number, it seems, was less a fire code calculation than a rhetorical device, a way of saying that true society was limited, knowable, and under control. McAllister himself admitted, in later writings, that the figure was somewhat flexible. Certain families were always included, others moved in and out depending on circumstance, and still others hovered on the edge, perpetually hoping for an invitation that might never come. On February 16, 1892, the New York Times published what it called Mr. McAllister's List of the 400, turning a private hierarchy into public knowledge. The list named specific families: the Schermerhorns, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Beekmans, names rooted in colonial Dutch and English settlement. It included newer fortunes that had earned acceptance through marriage, philanthropy, or careful cultivation of cultural refinement. But the list also made visible, through omission, who did not belong. Families with industrial fortunes in railroad, steel, or oil found themselves excluded unless they could demonstrate the requisite ease. The result was a taxonomy of American aristocracy, published in black and white, that both codified and exposed the mechanisms of social exclusion. The publication caused immediate controversy. Some of those named felt embarrassed, others were offended by the presumption that society could be reduced to a numbered list. Those left off the list responded with anger or quiet humiliation, depending on temperament. McAllister defended his work by insisting that he was merely describing what everyone already knew, that New York society operated according to unwritten rules, and that Caroline Astor's ballroom was the ultimate test of whether one truly belonged. Inside the ballroom at 355th Avenue, the social mathematics were on display. On the evening of Caroline's annual ball, usually held in late January or early February, the gallery filled with guests who had passed multiple filters before arriving. First, they had received an invitation, engraved on heavy cardstock, delivered by hand. Then, they had appeared at the opera earlier in the evening, where Caroline held a box in the Diamond Horseshoe, a curved tier of boxes occupied by the city's wealthiest families. At intermission, guests would pay their respects at her box, a ritual that confirmed they were expected later at the house. Finally, they would proceed by carriage up Fifth Avenue to number 350, where footmen checked names against a list before admitting them through the front door. Once inside, guests moved through the sequence of drawing rooms, each more richly decorated than the last, until they reached the gallery. There, beneath the chandeliers and surrounded by paintings, the real sorting began. Caroline occupied a central position, often standing or seated near the red velvet ottoman, and around her the room organized itself into zones of proximity. Those in her immediate circle, a core of perhaps 24 women, stood or sat closest. They were the ones who had known her longest, who shared memories of Newport summers and European tours, who understood the unspoken codes of her world. A second zone included younger women, daughters and nieces of the core group, who were being introduced to society and who watched Caroline for cues about how to behave. A third zone, furthest from the center, held those who had been invited but were not yet fully accepted. New money, or families from other cities, or individuals whose invitation was provisional. The red ottoman became, in this geometry, a compass needle. Those invited to sit upon it, usually during a pause between dances or when supper was announced, were understood to have arrived socially. Those who circled the room throughout the evening without ever being summoned to the ottoman learned through silence that they remained on the periphery. The furniture itself was unremarkable. Plush upholstery, carved wood, a marble urn rising from its center. But in the context of the ballroom, it became a throne without a crown, a seat that conferred status simply through proximity to Caroline's approval. Contemporary observers noted the anxiety that the ballroom produced. One society memoir, published years later, recorded that a fate worse than failing to attract suitors was not to be invited to Mrs. Astor's ball at all. The phrasing captured the stakes. Exclusion from the ballroom was not just a personal disappointment, but a public verdict on one's worth. Young women who failed to receive an invitation understood that their prospects for advantageous marriage had narrowed. Families hoping to cement their social position knew that an evening at 350 Fifth Avenue could confirm or deny their place in the hierarchy. The 400, as published and as practiced, was never a stable list. Families rose and fell, fortunes were made and lost, marriages shifted alliances. But the ballroom itself remained constant, a physical space where these shifts could be observed and measured. McAllister's number gave the process a kind of scientific legitimacy, as if society could be counted and sorted like inventory. In reality, the number was always approximate, always contested, always a little bit mythical. But the myth served a purpose. It made the rules visible, even if the rules themselves remained arbitrary. In the winter of 1892, society discovered that its worth could be measured not in dollars, but in how many bodies could fit between Mrs. Astor's walls. In the spring of 1893, William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew by marriage, made a decision that would force her hand. He announced that he would demolish the house at 33rd Street and Fifth Avenue, the mansion that had belonged to his father, William Waldorf's own father, and that stood just 1 block south of Caroline's brownstone at 355th, and replace it with a luxury hotel. The Waldorf Hotel, as it would be called, was a deliberate provocation. William Waldorf and Caroline had been feuding for years over who had the right to be called the Mrs. Astor. He believed his wife, as the spouse of the eldest son, held the title. Caroline, as the wife of the younger son, but also as the undisputed social leader, refused to yield. The dispute was petty and profound. In a world where titles and precedence mattered more than accomplishment, the question of who could claim the definite article was not trivial. The hotel rose quickly. By 1893, a 13-story structure in the German Renaissance style, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, dominated the block. Its presence changed the character of the neighborhood. Where once there had been a quiet residential enclave, now there were crowds, carriages dropping guests at the hotel entrance, and commercial traffic. The noise and bustle crept northward toward 350 Fifth Avenue. Caroline's brownstone, once at the center of a genteel district, now stood adjacent to what was, essentially, a very grand public house. The indignity was intolerable. Caroline's response was to leave. In 1894, she and her son, John Jacob Astor IV, decided to sell the brownstone and build a new house further uptown, in a neighborhood that was still predominantly residential and that offered a view of Central Park. The site they chose was at the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, a double lot large enough to accommodate 2 mansions, one for Caroline, one for her son. The arrangement would preserve family proximity while allowing each household its own entrance and identity. More importantly, the new location would place Caroline far enough from the Waldorf to restore the sense of aristocratic distance that the hotel had destroyed. The sale of 355th Avenue was completed in early 1895. The brownstone, with its memories of 30 years of social dominance, was purchased by developers who would eventually raze it to make way for the Waldorf Astoria, an expanded hotel created by merging William Waldorf's Waldorf with a new tower, the Astoria, built by John Jacob Astor IV, as a kind of architectural countermove. The irony was noted in the press. The Astor family, having fought over precedence, had ended up in the hotel business together, their mansions replaced by a structure that would become one of the most famous in New York. But before that transformation, Caroline had already moved on. In the summer of 1894, at her Newport estate, Beechwood, she met with Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had become the preferred designer for America's wealthiest families. Hunt, then in his 60s, had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and had returned to the United States with a vision of American architecture that drew heavily on French Renaissance models. He had designed the breakers for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Marble House for William Kissam Vanderbilt, and Biltmore for George Washington Vanderbilt II. His buildings were not merely large, they were self-conscious statements of cultural ambition, attempts to translate European aristocratic architecture into an American idiom. Caroline commissioned Hunt to design a double mansion at 841 Fifth Avenue that would surpass anything she had left behind. Hunt proposed a structure in the Louis XIII and François I French Renaissance style, inspired by the Château de Blois and other Loire Valley palaces. The exterior would be faced in Indiana limestone, not brownstone, giving it a pale, almost luminous quality. The roofline would be steeply pitched with mansard roofs, dormers, and elaborate stone cresting. The entrance would be sheltered by a porte cochere, allowing carriages to deposit guests under cover. The scale would be immense. The combined structure would be the largest private residence on Fifth Avenue, containing more than 100 rooms across 5 floors. Construction began in late 1894. Contemporary photographs show the site as a raw urban excavation, exposed bedrock, timber scaffolding, heaps of cut stone awaiting installation. Hunt supervised the work closely, making frequent visits to ensure that his design was executed correctly. He specified materials with precision: Caen stone for certain decorative elements, wrought iron for the cresting, bronze for the doors and grills. The interior would feature marble from Italy, carved wood from France, and fixtures imported from European workshops. The cost was never publicly disclosed, but estimates in later architectural histories suggest the project exceeded $2 million, an extraordinary sum in the 1890s. Hunt died in the summer of 1895, before the mansion was completed. His death was a loss not just to Caroline, but to an entire generation of American architects who saw in his work a model of how to reconcile European tradition with American ambition. His sons and associates completed the project according to his plans, and by late 1896, the house was ready for occupancy. Caroline moved in that autumn, bringing with her the furniture, paintings, and objects that had filled the gallery at 350 Fifth Avenue, including the red velvet ottoman that had served as the symbolic center of her old ballroom. The new house announced itself through sheer presence. Where the brownstone at 350 Fifth had been discreet, the mansion at 841 Fifth was unavoidable. Its pale stone façade caught the morning and evening light, making it appear almost to glow. The mansard roofs and dormers gave it a vertical emphasis that contrasted with the lower, flatter profiles of neighboring buildings. The porte cochere signaled that this was a house designed for arrival, for spectacle, for the orchestration of entrances. Passers-by on Fifth Avenue could see, even from a distance, that something had changed. The social center of New York had moved north, and it had moved into a palace. Inside, the house was organized around circulation and display. Guests entered through a domed vestibule lined with marble, then passed into a great stair hall where bronze busts of Astor ancestors stood on pedestals. The staircase itself was wide enough for 2 people to ascend side by side, and it rose in a single dramatic sweep to the second floor, where the principal reception rooms awaited. The drawing rooms, the dining room, the library, each was larger and more elaborately decorated than its counterpart in the old brownstone. But the true destination, the room that justified the entire house, was at the rear, the ballroom. Caroline had not merely replicated her old gallery. She had expanded it, improved it, and turned it into something that no other private house in New York could match. The new ballroom stretched across the width of both mansions, a single vast space that could accommodate more than 1,000 guests. Its walls were paneled in satin, its floor was laid in herringbone parquet, and its ceiling was supported by carved cornices that dissolved in the evening light into a haze of gold. The furniture from 355th Avenue, including the red ottoman, was installed exactly as it had been before, but now it was dwarfed by the scale of the new room. The ottoman, which had once seemed substantial, now appeared almost modest, a single anchor in a sea of space. When the Waldorf rose above her brownstone, Mrs. Astor did not surrender to society. She simply decided to build a house large enough to contain it. The ballroom at 840-841 Fifth Avenue, completed in the winter of 1896 and first used for a reception in early 1897, was not simply a room but a carefully designed instrument for the production of social meaning. Richard Morris Hunt and his successors had understood that Caroline Astor required not just space but a specific kind of space, one that could accommodate large numbers while maintaining hierarchies of proximity, one that could display art while serving as a stage for human performance, and one that could translate architectural grandeur into social authority. The result was a room that measured approximately 80 feet in length and 40 feet in width, with ceilings that rose nearly 20 feet above the floor. It was, by contemporary accounts, the largest private ballroom in New York, capable of holding 1,200 guests if necessary, though Caroline rarely invited more than 400 or 500 to any single event. The room's design drew on multiple traditions. The satin-paneled walls recalled French palace interiors, particularly the galleries at Versailles and Fontainebleau, where silk damask provided both acoustic dampening and a luminous backdrop for paintings. The parquet floor, laid in a herringbone pattern, was a nod to English country houses, where polished wood was preferred over marble for dancing. The ceiling, coffered and gilded, borrowed from Italian Renaissance models, creating a sense of height and dignity. 4 massive crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each holding dozens of electric bulbs shaped to resemble candles. The chandeliers were linked by garlands of smaller lights, creating what one newspaper description called pearls of light strung across the room. At the center of the ballroom, placed on a slight platform to elevate it above the surrounding floor, stood the red velvet ottoman. The piece had been moved from the old house on 355th Avenue, but it had been refurbished and slightly enlarged to suit the scale of the new room. It was circular, approximately 12 feet in diameter, with a high upholstered back that rose to a central marble urn. The velvet was a deep crimson, chosen to contrast with the gold of the paneling and the white of the ceiling. The urn, carved from Carrara marble, was decorative rather than functional, a kind of sculptural punctuation mark that drew the eye upward. The ottoman could seat 12 to 15 women, their skirts arranged around them in carefully managed cascades of silk and lace. In photographs, it appears as both furniture and monument, a piece designed not for comfort, but for ceremony. The walls of the ballroom were crowded with paintings. Caroline had been collecting European art for decades, and by the late 1890s, her collection included landscapes by minor Dutch masters, portraits of anonymous aristocrats, and genre scenes that depicted rural life in pastoral terms. The paintings were not, by the standards of major European collections, particularly distinguished. Few were attributed to famous artists, and later scholarship has suggested that several were copies or works by followers rather than masters. But in the context of the ballroom, their individual quality mattered less than their cumulative effect. They transformed the space into a gallery, a private museum that demonstrated Caroline's cultural refinement and her claim to be not just a hostess, but a patron of the arts. Between the paintings hung mirrors in gilded frames, positioned to multiply the light from the chandeliers and create the illusion of even greater space. The mirrors also allowed guests to see themselves and each other from multiple angles, turning the room into a kind of social panopticon where visibility was constant and unavoidable. To be in the ballroom was to be seen, and to be seen was to be judged. The architecture made privacy impossible. It insisted on display. At the far end of the room, above the entrance, a minstrel's gallery provided space for an orchestra. The gallery was screened by carved Chinese panels, painted in black lacquer and gilded with scenes of birds and flowering branches. The screens allowed musicians to play without being fully visible, creating the effect of music that emerged from the architecture itself. Below the gallery, a massive marble chimney-piece, carved with classical motifs and topped by a mirror, provided a focal point for the room. The chimney-piece was rarely lit. Its function was symbolic, a reminder that even in a space designed for public performance, there was a domestic hearth, a place of warmth and intimacy, however vestigial. The floor was covered in places with oriental rugs, Persians and Turks mostly, chosen for their rich colors and intricate patterns. The rugs softened the acoustic and provided zones of warmth within the larger expanse of polished wood. Around the perimeter of the room, smaller chairs and settees were arranged in conversational clusters, allowing guests to sit and observe the dancing without participating. The furniture was French, mostly Louis XV and Louis XVII reproductions, upholstered in brocades and velvets that complemented the wall panels. The overall effect was one of carefully orchestrated richness. Every surface was decorated, every corner was furnished, and yet the room did not feel cluttered. It felt instead complete, as if every object had been chosen and placed with absolute certainty. Lighting was critical. During the day, a large skylight at the center of the ceiling allowed natural light to flood the room, illuminating the paintings and casting soft shadows on the parquet. At night, the chandeliers took over, their electric bulbs, providing a steady, brilliant light that was both modern and theatrical. Electric lighting had only recently become reliable in private homes, and Caroline's decision to install it rather than rely on gas was a statement of technological confidence. The chandeliers could be dimmed for dancing or brightened for supper, allowing the room to shift moods throughout an evening. Contemporary accounts describe the sensory experience of entering the ballroom. Guests passed through the drawing rooms on the second floor, each progressively more ornate until they reached the threshold of the ballroom itself. There, the space opened suddenly. The ceiling rose, the light intensified, and the room revealed itself in full. The effect was designed to be overwhelming, a moment of visual and spatial awe that confirmed the power of the house and, by extension, the power of its owner. One visitor, writing years later, recalled the feeling of crossing into the ballroom as stepping into a painting, a comparison that captures both the room's aesthetic richness and its essential unreality, a space so carefully composed that it seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. The ottoman, at the center, served as both destination and obstacle. Guests entering the room had to decide whether to approach it or to remain at the edges. Those invited to sit upon it were understood to have arrived at the heart of Caroline's world. Those who circled the room without ever reaching it learned through spatial exclusion the limits of their acceptance. The furniture, in this sense, was not neutral. It was an active participant in the social choreography, a piece that sorted guests through proximity and elevation. The ballroom was photographed extensively, both by professional photographers hired by Caroline and by society journalists covering her events. The surviving images show the room at various moments, empty, with light streaming through the skylight, filled with guests in evening dress, the women in pale gowns and the men in black tailcoats, decorated for special occasions with flowers and garlands. In every photograph, the red ottoman is visible, always at the center, always occupied or conspicuously empty. The photographs also reveal something that written descriptions cannot. The room, for all its grandeur, was not particularly large by palace standards. It was vast for a private home in New York, but it was not Versailles. Its power came not from absolute scale, but from the density of its decoration and the precision of its social function. Later, historians would debate whether the ballroom represented the pinnacle of American aristocratic aspiration or its absurdity. Some argued that Caroline had succeeded in creating a space that could rival the great houses of Europe, a room where American wealth was transformed into American culture. Others pointed out that the ballroom was fundamentally imitative, a copy of European models that lacked the historical depth and continuity of the originals. Both views are, in some sense, correct. The ballroom was an achievement, a demonstration of what American money and ambition could build in a single generation. But it was also, inevitably, an artifact of its moment, a room designed to stabilize a social hierarchy that was already beginning to fracture under the pressure of new wealth, new technologies, and new ideas about what society could and should be. In photographs, the red ottoman looks like a piece of furniture. In life, it was a compass needle, always pointing to those who truly belonged. On the evening of January 15, 1900, Caroline Astor's annual ball unfolded according to a sequence that had, by then, achieved the status of ritual. The evening began not at the mansion, but at the Metropolitan Opera House, where Caroline maintained a box in the Diamond Horseshoe, the curved tier of boxes occupied by the city's wealthiest families. The opera that night was Faust, and Caroline arrived during the first act, dressed in black velvet with her diamond stomacher, a bib-like ornament of interlocking stones glittering in the gaslight. Around her, the other boxes filled with familiar faces: Vanderbilts, Livingstons, Beekmans, families whose names had been linked to New York for generations. The opera itself was secondary. The real performance was social, a public display of who was present and who was not. At the first intermission, guests began to pay their respects at Caroline's box. Young women in pale gowns, accompanied by their mothers or chaperones, would approach the box, curtsy slightly, and exchange a few words with Mrs. Astor. The interaction was brief, formal, and decisive. Caroline's acknowledgement, a nod, a smile, a word of greeting, confirmed that they were expected at the house later that evening. Those who did not receive such acknowledgement understood that their evening would end at the opera. The box, in this sense, was the first filter, a semi-public space where invitations issued weeks earlier were either confirmed or quietly rescinded. By the end of the second act, the boxes began to empty. Guests who had been acknowledged by Caroline made their way to carriages waiting outside the Opera House and proceeded up Fifth Avenue to 65th Street. The journey took only a few minutes, but it was long enough for anticipation to build. Carriages lined up along the curb, their lamps glowing in the winter dark. Footmen in livery stood at the entrance to the porte cochere, checking names against a list. Those whose names appeared were admitted. Those whose names did not were turned away with polite firmness. Even at this stage, hours after the original invitation had been issued, access was not guaranteed. The entrance to the mansion was designed to impress. Guests stepped from their carriages onto a crimson carpet that led through the bronze doors into the vestibule. The vestibule, domed and lined with marble, was lit by electric lamps that cast a warm, steady glow. On the walls, bronze busts of Astor ancestors, John Jacob Astor, William Backhouse Astor Sr., stood on pedestals, silent witnesses to the family's lineage. The vestibule was not a place to linger. It was a threshold, a space that marked the transition from the public street to the private interior. Guests moved quickly through it, handing their cloaks to attendants and ascending the great staircase to the second floor. The staircase was the first moment of true spectacle. Wide enough for two people to ascend side by side, it rose in a single sweep, its balustrade carved in wood and topped with bronze fittings. The walls of the stair hall were hung with tapestries and mirrors, creating a sense of depth and richness. At the landing, a large portrait dominated the wall. Caroline herself, painted by Carolus Duran in the 1880s, dressed in dark silk with her diamond stomacher, her expression calm and slightly distant. The portrait served as both decoration and assertion. This was her house, her staircase, her world. At the top of the staircase, guests passed through a series of drawing rooms, each more elaborately furnished than the last. The first drawing room, nearest the stair hall, was decorated in shades of gold and cream, with Louis XV furniture and paintings of pastoral scenes. The second drawing room introduced darker tones, burgundy and forest green, and heavier furniture, including carved cabinets displaying Sèvres porcelain and Chinese vases. The third drawing room, closest to the ballroom, was the most opulent. The walls were paneled in silk damask, the ceiling was gilded, and the furniture was arranged in conversational groups that suggested intimacy, even as the room's scale denied it. Throughout these rooms, Thomas Haze, Caroline's butler, moved with quiet efficiency. Haze had been with the Astor household for more than 20 years, first at 355th Avenue and now at the new mansion. He knew every guest by name, understood the unspoken hierarchies, and managed the flow of people through the house with the precision of a stage director. When a guest arrived whose status required special attention, an elderly dowager, a visiting European aristocrat, a young woman making her debut, Jade would quietly alert Caroline, allowing her to position herself for the introduction. His role was invisible but essential. Without him, the social choreography would have dissolved into chaos. Finally, guests reached the threshold of the ballroom. The doorway was framed by carved pilasters and topped by a gilded pediment, a miniature architectural statement that marked the transition from private to semi-public space. As guests stepped through, the room revealed itself, 80 feet of light and gold, the chandeliers blazing overhead, the walls crowded with paintings, the floor already filled with guests in evening dress. An orchestra, hidden behind the Chinese screens in the minstrel's gallery, played a waltz. The air smelled of flowers. Thousands of roses, orchids, and lilies had been arranged in massive urns placed around the perimeter, and of perfume, the layered scents of 100 women moving through the same space. Caroline stood near the center of the room, close to the red velvet ottoman but not seated upon it. She greeted guests as they arrived, extending her hand for a brief clasp, exchanging a few words and then releasing them to circulate. The greeting was courteous but not warm. Caroline's demeanor was always formal, even with those she had known for decades. Her role was not to be liked, but to be respected, and her presence in the room, upright, composed, dressed in black or dark blue, established the tone for the evening. Around her, the room organized itself into the familiar geometry. Those closest to her formed the inner circle, those slightly further away the second circle, and those at the edges the outermost ring. The ottoman, still unoccupied, waited. As the evening progressed, the ballroom filled. By 10 o'clock, perhaps 400 guests were present, enough to make the room feel lively without being uncomfortably crowded. The dancing began in earnest. Waltzes, polkas, and the occasional quadrille, dances that required both skill and confidence. To stumble during a waltz, to miss a cue during a quadrille, was to mark oneself as uncertain, and uncertainty was the one quality that Caroline's world could not tolerate. Those who danced well, who moved across the parquet with ease, who timed their steps to the music without visible effort, confirmed their belonging. Those who hesitated, who retreated to the edges after a single dance, learned that they were not yet ready for the center. Between dances, guests paused to rest. Some moved to the drawing rooms, where supper was laid out on long tables, oysters, terrapin, game birds, ices, champagne. Others remained in the ballroom, sitting on the chairs arranged around the perimeter, or standing in small groups near the windows. And some, a very few, were invited to sit on the red ottoman. The invitation was never explicit. Caroline would simply gesture toward the ottoman, or she would lead a small group of women there and sit down herself, and the others would follow. To be included in that circle was to be confirmed. These were the women who had arrived, whose place in society was no longer provisional. Those who watched from the edges understood that they were witnessing not just social preference, but social judgment. One contemporary account, recorded in a memoir published years later, described the ballroom that evening as a machine for sorting souls. The phrasing is melodramatic, but it captures something true. The room, the furniture, the choreography, all of it was designed to make visible the invisible hierarchies that govern New York society. The ballroom did not create those hierarchies, it simply revealed them with a clarity that could be both thrilling and devastating. To be inside the room was to be inside the system. To understand where one stood, near the center or at the edges, was to understand one's value in the eyes of the only people who, in that world, mattered. By the time a guest reached the red ottoman, they had already passed 3 tests: the list, the opera box, and the staircase. Ward McAllister, who died in 1895, just as the new mansion was being completed, had left behind a set of principles that Caroline Astor continued to apply with the precision of an auditor. His most famous dictum, that only those with at least 3 generations of wealth and the ability to move at ease in the grandest ballrooms truly belonged, was not just a social criterion but an architectural one. It assumed that certain spaces by their nature tested character. A ballroom like Caroline's, with its chandeliers and parquet and painted walls, was not simply a venue for dancing. It was an instrument for revealing who possessed the intangible quality of grace and who did not. Grace, in McAllister's formulation, was not a moral virtue but a social performance, the ability to cross a floor without self-consciousness, to dance without anxiety, to sit or stand in a gilded room without appearing either awestruck or uncomfortable. It was, crucially, something that could not be taught. It had to be inherited, absorbed from childhood in houses where such rooms were ordinary. The ballroom at 840-841 Fifth Avenue functioned in this sense as what one later observer called a social X-ray, a space that made inner hierarchies visible through spatial arrangement and choreographed movement. The mechanics were not hidden. Guests entering the room could see immediately who stood near Caroline and who stood at the edges. They could observe who was invited to dance and with whom. They could note who sat on the red ottoman during intervals and who remained standing. The room did not disguise its judgments, it displayed them, and in doing so, it made those judgments seem natural, as if the arrangement of bodies in space simply reflected an underlying order rather than imposing one. The dances themselves were part of the mechanism. Cotillions and quadrilles, the structured dances favored at Caroline's balls, required participants to be selected in advance and to perform specific figures in sequence. The selection was never random. Caroline, or her designated assistant, would choose pairs based on criteria that were understood but rarely spoken: family connection, age, marriageability, and, above all, social standing. To be chosen for a dance was an honor. To be passed over was a public statement of exclusion. One society column from the period described the moment when the cotillion was announced as a hush followed by a murmur, the hush being the anticipation of selection and the murmur being the response, satisfaction for some, disappointment for others, once the names were read. The dances made visible not just who belonged, but who belonged with whom. A young woman dancing with the son of an established family was being presented as a suitable match. A newcomer dancing with an older, more established figure was being sponsored, introduced, and evaluated. The floor itself became a kind of public ledger, each partnership a line item in the ongoing calculation of status. Those watching from the edges, and there were always those watching, could read the ledger and draw conclusions about alliances, prospects, and power. The ballroom also produced gradations of exclusion that were more painful than outright rejection. To be invited to Caroline's ball was an achievement, but it did not guarantee equal access to the room's inner spaces. Some guests spent the entire evening at the periphery, near the doors or in the drawing rooms, never quite reaching the center. They were present, but they were not participants. Their invitations had been issued out of obligation or courtesy. Perhaps they were relatives of someone Caroline could not afford to offend, or representatives of families whose fortunes were substantial enough to require acknowledgement. But they were not truly welcome. The architecture allowed for this kind of graded exclusion. The room was large enough that one could be inside it and still be effectively outside the circle that mattered. The red ottoman at the center was the final measure. Throughout the evening, it remained the one constant, a piece of furniture that, by its placement and its function, defined the room's geometry. Those invited to sit upon it were not just resting, they were occupying the symbolic heart of New York society. The invitation to sit was never casual. Caroline would approach a small group of women, usually those she had known for years, whose families were beyond question, and lead them to the ottoman. They would arrange themselves on its circular surface, their gowns spreading around them, and for a few minutes they would occupy a space that was both literal and metaphorical, the center of the room and the center of the social world it represented. Contemporary observers noted the careful choreography of these moments. One account, preserved in a private letter later donated to the New York Historical Society, described watching Caroline select who would sit on the ottoman as watching a queen distribute honors. The comparison was apt. Caroline's role was not democratic but monarchical, and her decisions about who could approach the ottoman and who could not were exercises of sovereign power. The letter writer, who remained unnamed in the archive, added that to be excluded from the ottoman was not a scandal. It was simply a fact, like being excluded from the throne room of a palace. One accepted it, or one left society. The ballroom's power, however, was not absolute. By the early 1900s, cracks were beginning to appear in the social edifice that Caroline and McAllister had built. Newer fortunes, industrialists, financiers, railroad magnates, were challenging the old Dutch and English families for dominance. These newcomers were wealthier, often by orders of magnitude, and they were less willing to accept the arbitrary rules that governed admission to Caroline's circle. They built their own mansions, held their own balls, and created alternative centers of power. The ballroom at 840-841 Fifth Avenue remained important, but it was no longer the only place where social legitimacy could be conferred. Moreover, the criteria for inclusion were increasingly recognized as arbitrary. Journalists and critics began to write openly about the contradictions of a system that valued lineage over accomplishment, that measured worth by how many generations one's family had been wealthy rather than by what one had done with that wealth. The publication of McAllister's 400 in 1892 had paradoxically weakened the system by making it visible. Once the rules were written down, they could be questioned. Once the names were listed, they could be challenged. The ballroom, for all its grandeur, could not escape the fact that it was built on foundations that were, ultimately, social rather than moral. And social foundations, as history repeatedly demonstrates, are always unstable. Yet within the ballroom, on any given evening, these larger forces were invisible. The chandeliers glowed, the orchestra played, the dancers moved across the parquet in patterns that had been repeated, with minor variations, for decades. The room created its own reality, a temporary suspension of historical time in which the hierarchies seemed fixed and the center seemed permanent. Those inside the room, particularly those near the ottoman, could believe, for a few hours, that their world would last. Those at the edges, watching and waiting, could hope that next time they might move closer. And those outside the room, reading about it in newspapers the next morning, could either envy the participants or dismiss them as relics of an age that was already passing. Under the chandeliers, money could be inherited or made, but grace in crossing the room could not be bought. The ballroom at 840-841 Fifth Avenue was not only a stage for social performance, but also a gallery for art, and Caroline Astor understood that the two functions were inseparable. The walls of the ballroom were crowded with European paintings, landscapes, portraits, genre scenes, hung in tiers that reached nearly to the ceiling. The collection was substantial, numbering perhaps 60 or 70 canvases, though exact inventories vary depending on the source. The paintings were not, for the most part, by artists whose names would be recognized outside specialist circles. There were no Rembrandts, no Vermeers, no works by the great masters of the Italian Renaissance. Instead, the collection consisted largely of works by 17th and 18th century Dutch and Flemish painters whose names appeared in auction catalogs but not in museum labels, pastoral scenes by followers of Ruysdael, portraits attributed to the school of Hals or Rembrandt, still lifes of uncertain authorship. The lack of canonical masterpieces was not, however, a sign of failure. Caroline's goal was not to assemble a museum-quality collection, but to create an environment that signaled cultural refinement and European sophistication. The paintings served, in this sense, less as individual works of art than as a collective atmosphere. They filled the walls, absorbed light, and gave the room a sense of historical depth. They suggested that the Astors were not merely wealthy but cultivated, that they had traveled to Europe, visited galleries, and developed the kind of connoisseurship that separated old money from new. The fact that many of the paintings were minor works or copies or attributions that later scholarship would question mattered less than the impression they created in aggregate. A room saturated with images of a European past that was, by implication, continuous with the Astor present. Among the paintings were several that did have documented provenance. A large canvas depicting a Dutch harbor scene attributed to Ludolf Bakhuyzen hung near the entrance to the ballroom. A pair of portraits, said to represent members of the minor German nobility, flanked the chimney-piece. A landscape showing a river valley at sunset, possibly by a follower of Claude Lorrain, occupied a prominent position above the red ottoman. These works, and others like them, were catalogued in later auction records, providing a fragmentary map of what once covered the ballroom walls. But the majority of the paintings have disappeared from the historical record, their titles and artists lost when the collection was dispersed after Caroline's death. In addition to paintings, the ballroom held sculpture and decorative arts. A marble statue of Venus, life-sized and draped in classical robes, stood on a pedestal near one of the windows. The statue had previously been displayed in the dining room at 350 Fifth Avenue, and its relocation to the new ballroom marked a shift in how Caroline thought about the function of art. No longer confined to private spaces, it was now part of the public performance. Sèvres porcelain vases, some standing nearly 4 feet tall, were placed on console tables around the perimeter of the room. The vases were decorated with painted scenes, mythological subjects mostly, and their bright colors contrasted with the darker tones of the oil paintings. Smaller objects, bronze figurines, ivory carvings, cloisonné boxes, filled the shelves and tables, creating a sense of abundance that bordered on excess. The overall effect was one of controlled richness. Every surface was occupied, every wall was hung, and yet the room did not feel chaotic. The paintings, the sculpture, the porcelain, all of it was arranged according to principles that valued symmetry and balance. The room's design did not allow for emptiness or negative space. It insisted that grandeur required saturation, that to be impressive, a room must be full. This aesthetic, borrowed from European palace interiors, was not unique to Caroline's ballroom, but it was executed there with particular intensity. The room was, in a sense, a domestic museum, a private space that aspired to the public functions of display and education. The presence of so much European art in a New York ballroom raises questions about the relationship between the interior of the house and the city outside. Contemporary photographs of Fifth Avenue in the 1890s and early 1900s show a streetscape that was rapidly changing. Immigrant neighborhoods pressed close to the avenue's eastern edge, separated from the mansions by only a few blocks. Department stores, Macy's, B. Altman, were beginning to open along the lower stretches of Fifth Avenue, bringing commercial energy to what had been a residential corridor. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the structure that had driven Caroline uptown, represented the encroachment of a new kind of public sociability, one that was open to anyone who could afford a room or a meal. The city, in other words, was diversifying, modernizing, and democratizing, even as the Astor Ballroom turned inward, filling its walls with images of rural Europe and aristocratic leisure. Inside the ballroom, the city was almost entirely absent. The paintings depicted foreign landscapes, foreign people, foreign architecture. The sculpture referenced classical antiquity. The porcelain evoked Versailles. There was nothing in the room that spoke directly to New York, to America, or to the industrial and financial systems that had generated the wealth necessary to build and furnish it. This absence was not accidental. The ballroom was designed to create a sense of distance from the commercial realities that sustained it, to suggest that the Astors and their guests occupied a space apart, a realm where culture and taste insulated them from the vulgarities of trade and labor. Yet the distance was, of course, illusory. The paintings had been purchased with money made in Manhattan real estate and fur trading. The ballroom itself stood on land whose value derived from its proximity to Central Park and its position along Fifth Avenue, the city's most fashionable address. The very existence of the room depended on the systems of labor, transportation, and commerce that connected New York to the rest of the world. The marble had been quarried in Italy and shipped across the Atlantic. The chandeliers had been manufactured in France. The parquet floor had been installed by craftsmen who lived in tenements within walking distance of the mansion. The ballroom, for all its European references, was a profoundly American space, built by American money in an American city, and its attempt to distance itself from those facts was both its purpose and its limitation. Contemporary critics occasionally noted this contradiction. One editorial, published in a reform-minded newspaper in 1902, pointed out that the cost of a single Astor ball could have funded a public library or a settlement house, and that the paintings hanging in the ballroom represented a concentration of wealth that had few parallels outside of European royal collections. The editorial did not call for the mansion to be seized or the collection to be donated. It simply observed that such extremes of private luxury coexisted uneasily with the public poverty visible on the city streets. The observation was not new. Similar critiques had been made of European aristocracies for centuries. But in the American context, where inherited titles did not exist and where democracy was, in theory, a founding principle, the contradiction felt sharper. Caroline Astor, for her part, did not respond to such critiques. Her silence was consistent with her broader approach to public life. She did not explain, did not justify, and did not engage with those outside her circle. The ballroom spoke for itself, and what it said was clear. This was a world built on distinctions, on the belief that not everyone was entitled to the same experiences or the same spaces. The art on the walls, like the ottoman at the center, was part of a larger system of exclusion, one that divided the city into those who could enter the ballroom and those who could only imagine it. In the Astor ballroom, the city outside barely appeared on the walls, yet every brushstroke inside was paid for by the streets beyond. By the early 1900s, Caroline Astor's ballroom was no longer the only center of New York society, and the mansion at 841 Fifth Avenue was no longer the only palace on the avenue. A generation of rival hostesses, women with fortunes as large or larger than the Astors, and with ambitions just as fierce, had built their own houses and established their own courts. The result was a kind of architectural arms race, a competition conducted not through speeches or manifestos, but through limestone, marble, and the deployment of European design vocabularies on an American street. The most famous of these rivals was Alva Vanderbilt, who in 1883 had opened her house at 665th Avenue with a costume ball so extravagant that it became a reference point for decades. Alva's house, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the style of a French chateau, was smaller than Caroline's eventual mansion, but had been built earlier, establishing a template for what new money grandeur could look like. The costume ball, which required guests to dress in elaborate historical or allegorical costumes, was designed to force New York society to acknowledge the Vanderbilt family, whose fortune came from railroads and was therefore suspect in the eyes of families like the Astors, whose wealth came from older, more discreet sources. The strategy worked. Caroline Astor, after initially refusing to attend, ultimately sent her daughter to the ball and eventually paid a formal call on Alva, a gesture that signaled acceptance. The incident demonstrated that even the Queen of New York society could be outmaneuvered by a rival with sufficient architectural and social firepower. Alva's eventual divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt and her remarriage to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont did not diminish her influence. She continued to host at her Newport estate, Marble House, a structure even more opulent than her Fifth Avenue residence, and she used her position to advocate for women's suffrage, linking social power to political activism in ways that Caroline Astor never did. But Alva's example inspired others. Mamie Fish, whose husband Stuyvesant Fish ran the Illinois Central Railroad, became known for hosting dinners and parties that were shorter, more informal, and more irreverent than Caroline's carefully orchestrated balls. Mamie's approach challenged the seriousness of Caroline's world, suggesting that society could be playful rather than solemn, and her house on the Upper East Side became an alternative gathering place for those who found Caroline's rituals stifling. Tessie Ulrichs, another Newport hostess, built Rosecliff, a mansion modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles, and used it to stage elaborate entertainments that rivaled anything Caroline could offer. Tessie's parties featured orchestras, theatrical performances, and spectacular decorations. At one event, the entire ballroom was filled with roses, creating a fragrant, immersive environment that guests would remember for years. The competition among these women was not openly hostile. They attended each other's events, observed each other's innovations, and borrowed ideas when they saw something effective. but it was competition nonetheless, a struggle for social dominance waged through hospitality, decoration, and the strategic deployment of architecture. The mansions themselves became arguments. Each new house on Fifth Avenue represented a claim about what wealth could and should look like. The Vanderbilt Chateau at 6065th, with its turrets and steep rooflines, argued for European aristocratic style. The Renaissance Palazzo, built by Henry Clay Frick further uptown, argued for Italian rather than French models. The Beaux-Arts townhouse built by Andrew Carnegie at 91st Street and 5th argued for a more restrained, civic-minded approach to domestic architecture, emphasizing library and cultural spaces over ballrooms. The houses talked to each other and to the city in a language of stone and scale. Inside these rival ballrooms, the rituals were similar to Caroline's but not identical. Each hostess developed her own signature. Alva favored costume themes, Mamie favored wit and brevity, Tessie favored spectacle. But all of them understood that a great ballroom required more than just space. It required a system. There had to be invitations, entrance rituals, choreographed dances, moments of recognition and exclusion. The specific mechanisms varied, but the underlying structure was constant. The ballroom as a space where social hierarchies were made visible and where access was controlled. The furniture in these ballrooms also echoed Caroline's model. Several of the rival hostesses installed central seating arrangements, not always circular ottomans, but daïses, throne-like chairs, or clusters of particularly ornate settees that served the same function: a focal point, a place of honor, a seat that conferred status on those invited to occupy it. The idea that a room should have a center and that the center should be both visible and exclusive was not unique to Caroline, but she had perfected it, and others adopted the template even as they competed with her for dominance. Contemporary observers noted the competition with a mixture of fascination and unease. Society columns in the New York Times, the Herald, and the Tribune devoted extensive coverage to the major balls and receptions, describing gowns, decorations, and guest lists in detail. The columns rarely criticized openly. Their function was to report, not to judge. But the sheer volume of coverage suggested that something significant was happening, that the concentration of wealth and the display of luxury along Fifth Avenue had reached a level that demanded attention. Reform-minded publications, meanwhile, published editorials and cartoons that mocked the excess, depicting the hostesses as modern-day Marie Antoinettes, oblivious to the growing inequality beyond their doors. The avenue itself became a kind of outdoor gallery, a public space where the private ambitions of individual families were made collectively visible. On any given evening, one could walk along Fifth Avenue and see multiple mansions lit for receptions, their windows glowing, their entrances crowded with carriages. The street was, in effect, a stage, and the mansions were sets, each one attempting to outshine the others. The architectural diversity, French chateaux, Italian palazzi, Beaux-Arts townhouses, created a visual cacophony that some critics found thrilling and others found vulgar. But there was no denying the ambition. Fifth Avenue in the early 1900s represented the fullest expression of Gilded Age confidence, a moment when private wealth felt no obligation to justify itself and every reason to celebrate. Yet the competition also revealed the limits of architectural permanence. Each mansion was built as if it would last forever, but each also contained the seeds of its own obsolescence. The houses were expensive to maintain, requiring armies of servants, constant repairs, and enormous heating and lighting costs. The fortunes that sustained them were, in many cases, tied to industries that were volatile. Railroads could fail, stock markets could crash, and inheritance taxes, though not yet enacted, were already being debated in progressive circles. The houses, in other words, were monuments built on unstable ground, and the women who presided over them knew, at some level, that their reign was contingent. The red ottoman in Caroline's ballroom, and its equivalents in the rival houses, represented not just a seat but a bet, a wager that social hierarchies could be stabilized through architecture, that the right combination of space, light, and furniture could freeze a moment of dominance and make it permanent. The wager was, as history would demonstrate, a losing one. But in the early 1900s, as the chandeliers glowed and the orchestras played and the guests circled the floors of a dozen grand ballrooms along Fifth Avenue, it was still possible to believe that the game was worth playing and that the houses would stand as long as the fortunes that built them. Along Fifth Avenue, every great staircase and every ballroom center asked the same quiet question: whose names will these rooms remember? In the first years of the 20th century, Caroline Astor's presence at her annual ball remained a fixed point in New York's social calendar, but the woman herself was aging, and those close to her could see the changes. By 1904, she was in her early 70s, still upright, still commanding, but no longer as energetic as she had been. Her balls continued, but they grew shorter. She spent less time standing in the ballroom and more time seated, often on the red ottoman, allowing guests to come to her rather than circulating through the room as she once had. Photographs from this period show her in dark gowns, her diamond stomacher still in place, her expression composed, but there is a stillness in the images that suggests fatigue. The last great ball at 841 Fifth Avenue took place in January 1906. Contemporary accounts describe it as equal in splendor to the balls of earlier years. The chandeliers blazed, the orchestra played, and the ballroom filled with guests in evening dress. But those who attended noted a difference in tone. Caroline was present, but she remained seated for most of the evening, and the choreography that had once been so precise seemed looser, less controlled. The ball was still an important event, but it no longer felt like the center of the universe. Other hostesses, other houses were drawing attention and energy. The social world that Caroline had built was beginning to distribute itself across multiple centers, and no single ballroom could contain it. By 1907, Caroline had stopped entertaining altogether. She remained in the mansion, cared for by her staff and visited by family, but she no longer presided over gatherings. Her health was declining. Accounts from the period mention confusion and frailty. And by 1908, it was clear that she was dying. In the months before her death, reports emerged, later recorded in memoirs and biographies, that she sometimes dressed in her finest gowns and descended the staircase as if to receive guests, only to find the drawing rooms empty. The image, a woman in diamonds standing alone in a silent ballroom, became one of the defining anecdotes of her final years, a symbol of how completely her world had depended on her presence to sustain it. Caroline Astor died on October 30th, 1908, in the house on Fifth Avenue. The obituaries were extensive, filling columns in every major newspaper. They described her as the Mrs. Astor, the woman who had defined New York society for more than 30 years. They noted her role in establishing the 400, her patronage of the arts, and her influence over social rituals that had shaped a generation. But the obituaries also marked an ending. With Caroline's death, the era she represented was over. The obituary in the New York Times referred to her passing as the end of an epoch, and while the phrasing was melodramatic, it was not inaccurate. The social structures she had built, the lists, the balls, the hierarchies made visible through ballroom choreography, would continue for a few more years, but they would never again have the same authority. Ownership of the mansion passed to her son, John Jacob Astor IV, who inherited not just the house, but the burden of maintaining it. John Jacob was then in his 40s, a man of varied interests. He was an inventor, a science fiction novelist, and a businessman. But he was not a social leader in the way his mother had been. He had his own priorities and his own vision for what the house should be. Within months of Caroline's death, he announced plans to remodel the mansion, to adapt it to his needs and to the changing times. The remodeling, designed by the architectural firm Carrière and Hastings, began in 1909 and was completed by 1910. The changes were substantial. The twin staircases that had originally served the double mansion were removed, and in their place a single, even grander staircase was installed, rising beneath a bronze-ribbed skylight dome. The drawing rooms were reconfigured, and the circulation through the house was altered to create a monumental great hall that emphasized verticality and light. The ballroom itself was not significantly changed in size, but its function began to shift. John Jacob used it less for balls than for dinners and smaller receptions. The room's social meaning, so carefully constructed by Caroline, began to loosen. In March 1910, John Jacob hosted a housewarming dinner at the remodeled mansion. The event was covered in the New York Times, which described a dinner for nearly 200 guests, followed by a cotillion for about 100 more. The ballroom was used, the chandeliers were lit, and the room functioned as it had in Caroline's time, but those present noted that the atmosphere was different. John Jacob was a more informal host than his mother had been, and the rigid hierarchies of the past seemed less important. The red ottoman was still in place, but it was no longer the symbolic center it had been. It was becoming, slowly, just a piece of furniture. In 1911, John Jacob married Madeline Talmadge Force, a young woman from a respectable but not prominent family. The marriage and the couple's decision to honeymoon in Europe removed John Jacob from New York for an extended period. He and Madeleine traveled through Egypt and Paris before boarding the RMS Titanic in Cherbourg for the return journey to New York. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and in the early hours of April 15th, the ship sank. John Jacob Astor IV, along with more than 1,500 others, died in the disaster. Madeline survived, rescued in one of the lifeboats. John Jacob's death at age 47 was a shock, not just to his family but to the city. He had been one of the wealthiest men in New York, and his loss, along with the loss of the Titanic itself, seemed to mark the end of an age of confidence and invulnerability. The mansion at 841 Fifth Avenue, which had been built to symbolize permanence, now passed into the hands of a widow who was still in her 20s. Under the terms of John Jacob's will, Madeline received the house in a substantial trust, but only on the condition that she not remarry. If she remarried, the house and the trust would pass to John Jacob's son from his first marriage, Vincent Astor. For several years, Madeleine lived in the mansion, maintaining it as her residence, but she was not a hostess in the tradition of Caroline Astor, and she had no interest in presiding over balls or social rituals. The ballroom, the great space that had once defined New York society, sat largely unused. Photographs from this period, when they exist, show the room still furnished, still magnificent, but empty. The chandeliers were rarely lit. The ottoman at the center waited for guests who did not come. In 1916, Madeline remarried, forfeiting the house and the trust. Ownership passed to Vincent Astor, John Jacob's son, who was then in his mid-20s. Vincent, like his father, had no interest in using the house as a social center. He found it too large, too expensive to maintain, and too tied to a social world that no longer felt relevant. He considered converting it to another use, perhaps a museum or a cultural institution, but the logistics were daunting, and the costs were prohibitive. The house, built to last, had become a burden within less than 20 years of its completion. The ballroom, once the most important room in New York, was now simply a large space filled with furniture and paintings. The red ottoman remained at the center, but it had lost its meaning. Without Caroline to confer status, without John Jacob to host gatherings, the ottoman was no longer a throne or a compass needle. It was just an old piece of furniture, slightly out of fashion, occupying space in a room that no one used. When the Mrs. Astor died in 1908, the ballroom did not fall silent, all at once, but its voice was never again quite the same. Between 1909 and 1912, the mansion at 841 Fifth Avenue underwent a transformation that signaled a broader shift in how New York's wealthiest families thought about their houses. Vincent Astor, inheriting the property in 1912 after his father's death on the Titanic, found himself in possession of a structure that was, by the standards of the Gilded Age, already becoming obsolete. The house was too large for a single family, too expensive to heat and staff, and too tied to social rituals that were fading. Vincent was a practical man, more interested in business and philanthropy than in maintaining his grandmother's ballroom, and he approached the problem of the house with a logic that would have been foreign to Caroline. He considered it an asset to be managed, not a monument to be preserved. The remodeling carried out by John Jacob Astor IV between 1909 and 1910 had already demonstrated that the house could be adapted. The creation of the Great Hall, with its bronze-domed skylight and single monumental staircase, had imposed a new spatial logic on the building, one that emphasized grandeur and light, but that also reduced the number of intimate rooms where small gatherings could take place. The ballroom, at the rear, remained largely unchanged in its dimensions, but its function had already begun to drift. John Jacob had used it for dinners and receptions, not for balls, and this shift away from dancing and toward seated entertaining was part of a broader change in how wealthy New Yorkers socialized. By the time Vincent took ownership, the ballroom was, in practical terms, a problem. It was too grand to be used frequently, but it was also too expensive to ignore. The chandeliers required constant maintenance. The paintings on the walls needed to be cleaned and, in some cases, restored. The parquet floor, subjected to decades of foot traffic, showed signs of wear. And the red velvet ottoman, which had been refurbished several times over the years, was beginning to look dated. Its deep crimson upholstery, so fashionable in the 1890s, now seemed heavy and old-fashioned in comparison to the lighter, more modern decorating styles that were coming into vogue. Vincent hosted a few events in the ballroom in the years immediately following his inheritance, mostly out of a sense of family obligation. In March 1910, shortly after the completion of his father's renovations, he had presided over the housewarming dinner and cotillion that the New York Times covered extensively. The event was a success, but it was also exhausting and expensive, requiring dozens of staff, elaborate catering, and weeks of preparation. Vincent, observing the costs and the effort involved, concluded that such events were not sustainable. The ballroom, he decided, would be used sparingly, if at all. The decision was both practical and philosophical. Vincent belonged to a generation that was beginning to question the values of the Gilded Age. He had been educated at Harvard, where he had been exposed to progressive ideas about wealth and social responsibility. He was interested in housing reform, in public health, and in using his fortune to address social problems rather than simply to display it. The ballroom, in this context, seemed not just unnecessary but almost embarrassing. A vast private space dedicated to leisure and exclusion at a time when the city outside was struggling with overcrowding, poverty, and inadequate infrastructure. Moreover, the economics of Fifth Avenue were changing. By the 1910s, the residential character of the avenue was being challenged by commercial development. Department stores, hotels, and office buildings were beginning to appear on the lower stretches of Fifth Avenue, and even the blocks near 65th Street, once securely residential, were seeing pressure from developers who recognized that the land was more valuable for institutional or commercial use than for single-family mansions. Property taxes were rising, and the cost of maintaining a house the size of 841 Fifth Avenue was becoming prohibitive even for someone as wealthy as Vincent Astor. In 1914, Vincent considered selling the house, but the market for such properties was limited. Who, after all, could afford to buy and maintain a mansion of this scale? And who would want to, given that the social structures that had justified the house's existence were themselves in decline? The 400, if they existed at all, were now scattered across multiple centers, Newport, Palm Beach, Long Island estates, and no single ballroom could claim to be the heart of society. Vincent consulted with real estate advisors and architects about possible alternative uses for the house. Could it be converted into apartments, into a club, into a museum? Each option had drawbacks, and none seemed financially viable. In the end, Vincent did nothing. He kept the house, used it occasionally, and otherwise left it largely empty. The ballroom, in particular, sat unused for months at a time. The furniture was covered with dust sheets, the paintings were left on the walls, and the chandeliers were not lit. Photographs taken during this period, and there are only a few, as the house was no longer of much interest to society photographers, showrooms that are still magnificent, but also slightly neglected. The gilt is tarnished, the upholstery is faded, and the overall atmosphere is one of fading grandeur. The red ottoman, still at the center of the ballroom, had by this time become an anachronism. It had been built for a specific purpose, to serve as the symbolic center of Caroline Astor's world, and that purpose no longer existed. Vincent considered removing it, or at least moving it to storage, but he never quite got around to making the decision. The ottoman remained in place, a relic of a social order that had dissolved, a piece of furniture waiting for a function that would never return. The house lingered in this state for more than a decade. Vincent occasionally hosted dinners or small receptions, and he allowed the ballroom to be used for a few charitable events, but the room never again functioned as it had in Caroline's time. The machinery of social sorting, the invitations, the choreography, the careful management of who stood where and who sat on the ottoman had broken down. Without that machinery, the ballroom was just a large room, beautiful but purposeless. By the mid-1920s, it had become clear that the mansion could not continue as a private residence. The costs were too high, the social justification had disappeared, and Vincent had other priorities. The house had been built to embody permanence, to assert that the Astor family and the social world they represented would last forever. But forever, in architecture as in life, is rarely more than a generation or two. The ballroom had been the center of New York society for less than 15 years. It had been in decline for another decade, and now, approaching 30 years after its completion, it was about to face the ultimate test, whether it could survive at all. By the time the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, the palace on Fifth Avenue had already been remodeled once. When its master did not return, the question was not if it would change again, but how. In the spring of 1925, Benjamin Winter Sr., a real estate developer with a track record of transforming Fifth Avenue mansions into institutional and commercial properties, approached Vincent Astor with an offer to purchase 84841 Fifth Avenue. Winter had been watching the mansion for years, aware that its days as a private residence were numbered. He understood that the value of the property lay not in the building itself, which was expensive to maintain and difficult to adapt, but in the land it occupied. A prime corner lot overlooking Central Park on what remained, despite the encroachment of commercial development, one of the most prestigious addresses in New York. Vincent accepted the offer. The sale was completed in late 1925, and by early 1926, Winter had made his plans public. The mansion would be demolished, and the site would be sold to Congregation Emmanuel, one of New York's oldest and most prominent Jewish congregations, which was seeking a location for a new temple. The announcement marked the end of the Astor Mansion as a physical structure, but it also initiated a final curious phase in the building's life: its conversion, through auction, from a home into a collection of objects. In April 1926, the American Art Association, one of New York's leading auction houses, took possession of the contents of the mansion and opened the house to the public for a series of preview days. For the first time since its completion in 1896, anyone could enter 841 Fifth Avenue. There was no guest list, no invitation required. Visitors paid a small admission fee and were allowed to wander through the rooms, inspecting the furniture, the paintings, the chandeliers, and the decorative arts that had filled the house for 30 years. The New York Times described the scene as both fascinating and melancholy. Crowds of people, many of whom had never been inside a Fifth Avenue mansion, moving through spaces that had once been the most exclusive in the city. The auction catalog, prepared by the American Art Association, ran to more than 300 pages. It listed every item in the house, from the largest pieces of furniture to the smallest decorative objects, each assigned a lot number and a brief description. The ballroom, unsurprisingly, occupied a significant portion of the catalog. The 4 massive crystal chandeliers, each weighing several hundred pounds and containing hundreds of individual crystals, were listed as separate lots, estimated to sell for thousands of dollars each. The satin wall panels, which could be removed and reinstalled in another setting, were listed as architectural elements and priced accordingly. The paintings, which had covered the ballroom walls for decades, were cataloged individually, with attributions where known and generic descriptions where they were not. The red velvet ottoman appears in the catalog, though its listing is brief and unassuming. It is described as a large circular ottoman upholstered in red velvet with carved wood base and central marble urn, and it is assigned a modest estimated value, far less than the chandeliers or the major pieces of furniture. The catalog does not mention the ottoman's symbolic function, does not note that it had served as the center of Caroline Astor's ballroom, does not record the social meanings it had once carried. It is simply a piece of furniture, old-fashioned and somewhat worn, waiting to be sold to whoever places the highest bid. The auction itself took place over several days in late April 1926. Buyers included private collectors, decorators, museum representatives, and curiosity seekers. The chandeliers sold quickly, purchased by a buyer acting on behalf of John Ringling, the circus magnate who was building a mansion in Sarasota, Florida, and who wanted architectural elements from notable New York houses to furnish it. The paintings sold for varying amounts, depending on their attributed artists and their condition. The wall panels, the cornices, and other architectural elements were purchased by dealers who specialized in salvaging and reselling such materials. The ottoman's fate is less clear. Auction records do not specify the buyer, and the piece has not been definitively located in any museum or private collection since. It may have been broken up for parts, or it may have ended up in storage, or it may still exist somewhere, unrecognized and unvalued. What is clear is that the auction succeeded in dispersing the contents of the ballroom across multiple locations and multiple owners. The room that had existed as a unified space, a carefully composed environment in which every element worked together to create a specific effect, was broken apart. The chandeliers went to Florida. The paintings went to various private collections. The furniture went to dealers and decorators. The architectural elements went to salvage yards. The ballroom, as a place, ceased to exist. What remained were fragments, scattered objects that could be traced back to Fifth Avenue, but that no longer carried the meanings they had once held. The New York Times, covering the auction, published an article that reflected on what was being lost. The headline read, "Social Center of the City Passes into History." The article noted that the Astor Mansion had been, for a generation, the place where New York society had gathered, where social hierarchies had been made visible, and where entrance had been both a privilege and a test. Now, the article observed that the world was being sold by the lot number. The tone was not mourning, but observation. The article recognized that the mansion had represented values, exclusivity, hierarchy, inherited privilege, that were themselves being questioned, and that the auction was simply the final stage in a process of dissolution that had been underway for years. For those who attended the auction preview days, walking through the ballroom was an uncanny experience. The room was still intact, still magnificent, but it was also empty of people, empty of purpose. The chandeliers were lit for the final time, not to illuminate a ball, but to display them for potential buyers. The paintings hung on the walls, but they were tagged with lot numbers. The ottoman sat at the center, but no one was invited to sit upon it. Visitors could stand where Caroline Astor had once stood, could look up at the same ceiling, could walk across the same parquet floor, but they were not guests. They were spectators, observers of a space that had already become historical. Photographs taken during the auction preview days capture this strangeness. In one image, the ballroom is shown from the entrance, the chandeliers glowing, the walls covered with paintings, the ottoman visible at the center. But the foreground is filled with people in street clothes, ordinary New Yorkers who had paid admission to see what had once been forbidden. The image, more than any description, shows how completely the ballroom's meaning had changed. It had been built to be exclusive, and now it was open to anyone with a quarter for admission and the curiosity to enter. The auction concluded in early May 1926. The house was emptied, the walls were stripped, and within weeks, demolition began. The ballroom, which had been designed to project permanence, to suggest that the social order it represented would last, had existed for exactly 30 years. Its contents had been dispersed, its architectural elements salvaged or destroyed, and its function, the sorting and display of social hierarchies, had become a historical curiosity, something to be read about in newspapers rather than experienced in person. In April 1926, the chandeliers that once decided who belonged to New York society were sold, one by one, to the highest bidder. The demolition of 840 841 Fifth Avenue began in the summer of 1926 and was completed by early 1927. The process was documented by photographers hired by the American Art Association and by newspaper journalists who recognized that the destruction of the Astor Mansion marked a turning point in the city's architectural history. The photographs show the house at various stages of dismantling. First, the roof is removed, exposing the interior structure to open sky. Then, the walls come down, revealing the layout of rooms that had been hidden behind the limestone facade. Finally, the foundation is excavated and the site is cleared to bare rock and earth. The demolition was methodical. Salvage companies removed anything that could be reused or sold: marble mantels, carved wood paneling, bronze fixtures, iron grillwork. The chandeliers, which had already been sold at auction, were carefully taken down and created for shipment. The parquet floor of the ballroom, still in good condition, was lifted in sections and sold to a dealer who specialized in reclaimed building materials. The satin wall panels, which had lined the ballroom walls for 30 years, were removed and offered to decorators, though it is not clear whether they found buyers or ended up in storage. The red velvet ottoman, if it had not been sold at auction, was presumably dismantled at this stage, its frame broken down, its upholstery discarded. What could not be salvaged was destroyed. The plaster ceilings, the gilt cornices, the architectural ornament that had been built specifically for this house and could not easily be adapted to another setting, all of it was demolished and carted away as rubble. Photographs from the demolition phase show workers standing amid heaps of broken plaster and splintered wood, the materials that had once formed drawing rooms and galleries, now reduced to debris. The contrast between the images of the intact ballroom, taken just months earlier during the auction preview, and the images of the demolition site is stark. In the space of a few months, a carefully constructed environment had been reduced to raw materials and empty space. Newspaper editorials responded to the demolition with a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Some lamented the loss of a landmark, noting that the Astor mansion had been one of the most significant examples of Gilded Age architecture in the city, and that its destruction represented the erasure of an important part of New York's history. Others argued that the mansion's demolition was overdue, that it symbolized the excesses of an era that the city had outgrown, and that the site could now be put to better use, serving the needs of a community rather than the vanity of a single family. The tension between these views, the mansion as cultural treasure versus the mansion as symbol of inequality, was not resolved, and perhaps could not be resolved. The house had been both things simultaneously: a work of architectural art designed by one of America's greatest architects and filled with objects of beauty, and a monument to a social system that was fundamentally exclusionary, and that had used architecture to reinforce hierarchies of wealth and lineage. Its destruction was both a cultural loss and a kind of democratic leveling, a recognition that no family, no matter how wealthy, could claim a permanent hold on the city's most valuable land. By 1929, the site had been rebuilt. Temple Emmanuel, designed by Robert D. Cohn, Charles Butler, and Clarence Stein in a Romanesque revival style, rose on the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street. The new building was massive, larger, in fact, than the Astor Mansion had been, and it served a congregation of more than 2,000 families. The temple's scale and its prominent location signaled the growing importance of New York's Jewish community, which had faced social exclusion from institutions like Caroline Astor's Ballroom, but which now occupied, literally, the same ground. The transformation was symbolic. Where once there had been a private house designed to sort and exclude, there was now a public building designed to gather and include. The corner at 5th Avenue and 65th Street, which had been the address of the most exclusive ballroom in New York, was now a place of worship and community. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, several of whom noted in articles and memoirs that the site's history encapsulated the arc of American society, from Dutch colonial settlement to Gilded Age aristocracy to 20th century pluralism. The ground itself was continuous, but the meanings layered upon it had changed completely. Other Fifth Avenue mansions met similar fates around the same time. The Vanderbilt Chateau at 665th Avenue was demolished and replaced by a commercial building. The Marble House in Newport, though it survived as a structure, ceased to function as a private residence and was eventually donated to a preservation society. The Frick Mansion on 70th Street became a museum, its rooms preserved but repurposed, no longer private but open to the public. The pattern was consistent. The great houses of the Gilded Age, built to be permanent, proved to be temporary. They lasted on average 30 to 50 years before economic, social, or political forces rendered them obsolete. The demolition of the Astor Mansion also marked the end of a specific architectural type. Fifth Avenue would continue to be lined with grand buildings, apartment houses, clubs, museums. But the era of the single-family palace was over. The economics no longer supported it. The cost of land, the expense of maintenance, and the availability of income and property taxes, which increased significantly in the 1920s and 1930s, made it impossible for even the wealthiest families to justify such structures. The houses had been built in an era when fortunes seemed limitless and when social hierarchies seemed fixed. Both assumptions proved false, and the houses fell as a result. In photographs taken from the street in the late 1920s, the empty lot at 65th Street and 5th Avenue is visible, a gap in the fabric of the avenue where the Astor Mansion had stood. The lot is surrounded by construction fencing, and in the background, other mansions are still visible, though many of them would be demolished within the next decade. The image captures a moment of transition. The old order is gone, but the new order is not yet fully in place. The city is in flux, and the empty lot is both an absence and a promise. For those who had attended Caroline Astor's balls or who had read about them in newspapers, the absence of the mansion was a kind of erasure. The building had been the physical manifestation of a social world, and without the building, that world became harder to recall, harder to believe had ever existed. The ballroom, which had been the most important room in that world, was now nowhere. It existed only in photographs, in auction catalogs, and in memories that would themselves fade as the people who had entered the room grew old and died. The red ottoman, which had been the symbolic center of the ballroom and, by extension, of New York society, had disappeared into the dispersal. If it still existed, it was no longer recognizable as the object it had been. Stripped of its context, removed from the ballroom, separated from the chandeliers and the paintings and the choreography of social selection, it was just an old piece of furniture, its velvet faded, its function forgotten. The center had not been held. It had been sold, dismantled, and scattered, leaving behind only the memory of what it had once meant. In the space of a single generation, the palace that had defined society survived in stone for less time than some of its paintings had survived on canvas. In the winter of 2025, the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street in Manhattan is occupied by Temple Emmanuel, a limestone structure in the Romanesque Revival style that has stood on the site since 1929. The temple is one of the largest synagogues in the world, capable of seating 2,500 people, and it serves as a religious, cultural, and community center for a congregation that numbers in the thousands. The building is imposing. Its arched entrance, its rose window, its twin towers rising above the avenue, all signal permanence and public purpose. To a casual passerby, there's nothing to indicate that this site once held a private mansion or that the mansion's ballroom was once the most exclusive social space in New York. The physical traces of the Astor House are gone. No plaque marks the location, no historical marker notes what once stood here. The limestone of the temple is a different color and texture from the limestone of the mansion, and the temple's footprint, while it occupies the same lot, does not align with the layout of the earlier building. Where the ballroom once extended across the rear of the property, the temple's sanctuary now rises, a vast interior space designed for communal worship rather than private entertainment. The transformation is complete. The ground is the same, but everything built upon it has been replaced. To reconstruct the Astor Mansion and its ballroom, one must turn to archives. The New York Historical Society holds photographs of the exterior and interior taken by professional photographers in the late 1890s and early 1900s. The images show the house in its prime, the limestone facade glowing in afternoon light, the ballroom filled with guests, the chandeliers casting their light over walls crowded with paintings. The photographs are sepia-toned, slightly faded, and they carry the distance of more than a century. Looking at them, it is possible to see what the ballroom looked like, but it is not possible to enter it. The room exists now only as a two-dimensional image, frozen in time. The Museum of the City of New York also holds materials related to the Astor Mansion. Floor plans, drawn by Richard Morris Hunt's office, show the layout of the house in precise architectural detail, the dimensions of each room, the placement of doors and windows, the location of the grand staircase, and the service stairs. The plans are technical documents drafted in ink on linen, and they were never intended to be viewed by the public. But they survive, and they allow scholars to reconstruct the spatial logic of the house with considerable accuracy. The ballroom, on the plans, is a large rectangle spanning the width of the property, with doors opening into it from the drawing rooms on the second floor and a separate entrance for the minstrel's gallery above. The plans do not capture the room's atmosphere, the light, the sound, the social choreography, but they do capture its structure. Auction catalogs from 1926, held in the archives of the American Art Association and now digitized in several online collections, provide inventories of what the ballroom contained. The chandeliers are described in detail, including their crystal configurations and their electrical fittings. The paintings are listed with their titles, attributed artists, and dimensions, though many of the attributions are vague or uncertain. The furniture is catalogued, including the red velvet ottoman, which appears as lot number 487, described simply as circular ottoman, red velvet, marble urn. The catalog does not assign it any special significance. It is one item among hundreds, valued at a modest sum. Some objects from the Astor Mansion have been traced to their current locations. The chandeliers sold to John Ringling were installed at Ca d'Azan, his mansion in Sarasota, Florida, where they remain today, still hanging in the great hall of a house that is now a museum open to the public. The chandeliers no longer light a ballroom in New York, but they have survived, and visitors to Ca d'Azan can see them and learn about their provenance. A few paintings from the Astor collection have been identified in museum holdings or private collections, their provenance lines noting former collection of Mrs. William Astor, Fifth Avenue. These objects provide a fragmentary material link to the ballroom, a way of tracing, across geography and time, pieces of a room that no longer exists as a unified space. Other furnishings have disappeared: the wall panels, the parquet floor, the carved cornices. If they survived the demolition, they have not been located. It is possible that they were installed in other buildings, their origin forgotten or deliberately obscured. It is equally possible that they were destroyed, that the effort and expense of salvaging them was not justified by their resale value. The red ottoman falls into this category of lost objects. It may exist somewhere, unrecognized, or it may have been discarded decades ago, its velvet rotted, its frame broken, its history unknown. The archival record preserves not just objects but also texts. Society columns from the 1890s and 1900s, digitized and searchable, provide accounts of Caroline Astor's balls, who attended, what they wore, how the rooms were decorated. These columns were written for readers who would never enter the ballroom, but who were curious about what happened inside it, and their tone is both adulatory and slightly voyeuristic. They describe gowns in exhaustive detail, note the presence of European nobility or prominent businessmen, and occasionally offer glimpses of the social dynamics: who danced with whom, who sat near Mrs. Astor, who was observed in conversation with a particular family. The columns are unreliable as strict factual documents. They were written to entertain as much as to inform, and they reflect the biases and interests of their authors. But they are, nonetheless, part of the archive, a textual record of how the ballroom was perceived by those outside it. Memoirs and biographies, written by people who attended Caroline Astor's balls or who knew her personally, provide another layer of documentation. These texts, published in the decades after her death, offer insider perspectives, descriptions of entering the mansion, accounts of the social anxieties involved in seeking an invitation, reflections on what it felt like to be in the ballroom. The tone of these memoirs varies. Some are nostalgic, remembering the balls as glamorous and exciting. Others are critical, noting the arbitrariness of the social hierarchies and the emotional cost of exclusion. Still others are simply descriptive, recording details: the smell of the flowers, the sound of the orchestra, the feel of the parquet underfoot, that give texture to the historical record. Digital archives have made much of this material accessible. Researchers can now view photographs, floor plans, auction catalogs, and newspaper articles from their computers without needing to visit physical archives. This democratization of access is significant. The Ballroom, which was once the most exclusive space in New York, can now be studied by anyone with an internet connection. The irony is clear. The room that was designed to be closed is now open, but only because it no longer exists as a physical space. The exclusivity that defined it in life has been replaced in death by a kind of universal access, but an access only to images and documents, never to the space itself. The story of the Astor Ballroom is, in the end, a story about memory and architecture. The ballroom was built to be permanent, to fix in stone and marble a social order that seemed to its creators natural and enduring. But the order was not natural, and the architecture could not make it enduring. The room lasted 30 years as a functioning social space, and in that time it shaped lives, confirmed hierarchies, and defined what it meant to belong to a particular world. Then, the room was dismantled, its contents were sold, and its physical form was erased. What remains is a collection of images, texts, and scattered objects, fragments that allow us to reconstruct imperfectly what the room was and what it meant. The red ottoman, in photographs, sits at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by light and gold, a throne without a queen, a center without a room around it. It is the last image of a world that believed in its own permanence, and the first image of a world learning that nothing built by human hands is permanent, that all monuments become memory, and that memory itself eventually fades. Today, the only guests who can still enter Mrs. Astor's ballroom are those who know how to read a photograph.